Welcome to JT Scary Tales. 4 terrifying encounters in the wilderness, true horror stories animated. Imagine being alone in a remote cabin when a stranger knocks on your door, or realizing something in the woods is watching you, and it's not an animal. These are the terrifying true stories of people who encountered the unknown in complete isolation. From a machete-wielding man with a sinister secret to a figure lurking in the dark, waiting for the perfect moment, these chilling encounters will make you question just how safe solitude really is. Watch, if you dare. Story 1. The Man with the Machete. Camping in the woods was something my friends and I had been doing for years. We were all former Boy Scouts, so we knew the ins and outs of surviving in nature. Over the years, we'd faced wild animals, venomous plants, and even the occasional run-in with bad weather. But nothing in our scouting experience prepared us for what happened that weekend. It was early January, the dead of winter in Florida, not exactly freezing, but cold enough to make a fire necessary. My 2 friends, Jake and Ethan, and I had booked a primitive campsite for the weekend. The place was more accessible than we'd expected, just a few miles from a rural highway, and lined with multiple campsites along a dirt road. Most of them were empty, save for a small family that looked like they had been living out there for a while. Then, there was him, across the dirt road from us. A lone man had set up camp. He had no tent, just a beaten-up Subaru, a makeshift tarp for shelter, and a small fire burning in a pit. We noticed him watching us almost immediately. He never spoke, never waved, just stared. And strapped to his hip was a massive machete. We tried to shake it off. Some people just preferred solitude. Maybe he was one of those off-the-grid types, escaping from society. But there was something off about him. The first night passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked up from our fire, I could feel his eyes on us from across the road. The first interaction. The next morning, Jake and I ventured into the trees to gather firewood. That's when he finally approached us. "You're picking the wrong kind," he muttered. I turned, startled. He had moved silently, suddenly appearing just a few feet away. His voice was hoarse, and he spoke with a strange, nervous energy, his hand hovering over the hilt of his machete. "There's better wood down by the creek," he continued, his words slurring slightly. We hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. Something about the way he stood, stiff, twitchy, like he was constantly on edge, made my stomach churn. Still, we nodded politely. "Thanks, man, we'll check it out." We didn't. The second he walked away, we grabbed the driest logs we could find and hurried back to camp. "I don't like this guy," Jake muttered as we tossed the wood into the pit. Ethan nodded, glancing over at the man's camp. "Dude, he's been watching us since we got here." We agreed to keep our distance. He was alone. We were 3. If something happened, we had the advantage, or so we thought. An unexpected arrival. Later that day, the real tension began. We were eating lunch when we saw headlights approaching. A car pulled into the site next to the machete man. Then another, and another. In total, 5 cars arrived, packed with at least 10 people, a group of loud, cheerful city folks who clearly had no idea what they had just walked into. The machete man's entire demeanor shifted. His body tensed, his fingers twitching at his side, his face twisted into something like rage. And then came the dog. 2 of the newcomers had brought their dogs, and one was off-leash. Within minutes, the playful golden retriever bounded over to the machete man's camp, barking and jumping excitedly. What happened next chilled me to the bone. He barked back at the dog, a guttural, animalistic sound. Then, he froze, every muscle in his body locking up as if he were battling an overwhelming urge. For a split second, I saw his hand twitch toward his machete. The dog's owner ran over, apologizing, grabbing the retriever's collar. And that's when the man spoke. "Next time that damn dog comes over here, I'm going to shoot the F-er, asterisk." The words came out cold, mechanical. The dog's owner laughed it off, a nervous, uncertain chuckle. But I saw the way the machete man's jaw clenched. He wasn't joking. The night descends. As the sun set, the newcomers became even more obnoxious. They were yelling, drinking, and blasting music, completely oblivious to the silent storm of rage brewing across the road. We stayed by our fire, keeping our voices low, exchanging uneasy glances. Every now and then, we'd sneak peeks at the machete man's camp. He hadn't moved, he just sat there, staring at them, his face illuminated by the glow of his dying fire. Ethan tried to lighten the mood by doing an impression of the most obnoxious guy in the group. It was stupid, but at that moment, we needed the laugh. By midnight, the temperature had dropped, our fire was dying. We called it a night. The morning confrontation. I woke up to voices. At first, I thought it was the city folks arguing. But then I recognized one of them. Jake. And then, him. I didn't move, keeping my breathing steady, pretending to be asleep. The machete man was standing inside our campsite, looming over Jake, who was crouched by the fire pit, trying to reignite the embers. His hand was on the hilt of his machete. "Which one of you was doing that dumbass voice last night?" Jake stammered. "That was me." A long silence followed. I squeezed my eyes shut, my fingers gripping the sleeping bag. "This is it, he's going to do something." Then, he laughed, loudly. "Man," he chuckled, shaking his head, "you guys had me rolling in my tent last night." Jake let out a forced chuckle. Cool, man." The man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm serious, I was this close. If you guys hadn't made me laugh, I was about 10 seconds from going over there with my 9mm and making them shut up." Jake didn't respond, neither did I. He stood there for a moment longer before straightening up. "Well, I'm gonna go try and get them to leave. See y'all later." He walked back to his camp, whistling. Jake turned, noticing I was awake. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded. "Good thing we're leaving today," he muttered. Ethan woke up, groggy and unaware of what had just happened. When we told him, his face drained of color. We packed up within the hour, skipping breakfast, leaving the site as fast as possible. As we drove away, we didn't look back, but as we reached the main road, Ethan broke the silence. "What if we get home and see on the news that some guy shot up a whole campsite?" No one answered. We didn't want to think about it. But deep down, we knew it was possible. Story 2. The mysterious figures in the woods. Camping had always been a way for me and my friends to escape the stress of everyday life. We had been doing it for years, former Boy Scouts, all seasoned in the ways of the outdoors. But what we encountered on this particular trip wasn't something any of us had ever trained for. We had picked a secluded campsite, deep in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness. It was perfect, far from civilization. No other campers, just us and the untamed woods. Or so we thought. The Forgotten Trail. There were 4 of us on this trip. Ryan, Tyler, Luke, and me. The area we chose had been a favorite of mine in the past. But things had changed since I had last been there. The trees were thicker, the trails that once weaved through the forest were now overgrown and forgotten. It was as if nature had reclaimed what was once hers. At first, my friends didn't mind. They were excited to be deep in the wild, away from the noise of the world. But as the day went on, their attitude shifted. They started acting differently. Ryan and Luke, normally the most respectful campers, began snapping branches off trees for fun. Tyler tossed beer cans into the woods, laughing as he did. "Dude, what the hell?" I snapped. "You guys know better than that. Relax, man," Ryan said, tossing me a beer. "Live a little." I tried to ignore it. Maybe they just needed to blow off some steam. But deep down, something felt wrong. A restless night. That night, we sat around the fire, laughing, drinking, and sharing old stories. But the deeper we went into the night, the more I felt like we weren't alone. It started with a sound. A soft crunching of leaves, slow, deliberate. I turned my head, staring into the darkness beyond our firelight. Nothing, just the dense, suffocating blackness of the forest. Then, I felt it, that primal sensation, the feeling of being watched. I glanced at my friends. They were too drunk to notice anything was off. But I did. I felt it deep in my bones. And I wasn't wrong. The eyes in the dark. Sometime past midnight, I finally crawled into my tent, exhausted but unable to sleep. The sounds of my friends laughing outside gradually faded until only the soft crackling of the dying fire remained. I lay there, listening. The wind rustled the leaves. An owl hooted in the distance. Then, I heard it. A single twig snapped. My eyes shot open. I turned my head toward the tent flap, heart pounding. Then, through the thin mesh of my tent, I saw them. A pair of glowing white eyes staring at me from the darkness. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The eyes weren't reflecting light like an animal's. They were self-illuminated, like two dim lanterns floating in the void. I felt cold all over. My body frozen in place as my mind screamed at me to do something, anything. And then, in the faintest whisper, it spoke. "What are you doing?" I nearly screamed. The voice wasn't my own, but it sounded exactly like me. The thing that wore my face. Shaking, I reached for my flashlight. My fingers fumbled over the switch, and the moment I turned it on, the eyes had moved, closer. Now, only 30 feet away from my tent, I could make out a shape, a figure standing perfectly still. It looked like a person. It was wearing the same clothes as Ryan's fiancée, Haley, down to the hoodie and jeans. But something was off. It didn't move right. It stood too still, like a puppet held up by invisible strings. And then, in my voice again, it said, "You shouldn't be out of your tent like that." My stomach twisted. It was copying me. I stumbled backward, my hand shaking as I aimed the flashlight at it. For a moment, it just stood there. Then, it took a step forward. I took a step back. It took another step forward. Every movement I made, it mirrored perfectly the impossible truth. I had to wake the others. Keeping my eyes on the figure, I slowly backed up toward Tyler's tent. My hands shook as I reached down, pounding on the canvas. "Tyler, get up, now." His groggy voice mumbled something unintelligible. But I didn't wait. I turned back toward the woods. It was gone. I whipped my flashlight around, scanning the trees. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched hadn't left. It had only gotten stronger. Tyler finally unzipped his tent, rubbing his eyes. "What the hell, man?" I pointed toward the woods. "Haley. She was just standing out there." Tyler frowned. "Dude, Haley's not here." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What? She's back home. She didn't come on this trip." I turned back to the woods, my heart hammering. Then, a voice came from inside the trees. Soft, mimicking, "Haley's not here." A perfect copy of Tyler's voice. The escape. That was it. I wasn't waiting around to see what would happen next. I stormed toward Ryan and Luke's tents, yanking them awake. "We're leaving, now," they groggily protested. But when they saw my face, and the panic in my voice, they didn't argue. We packed in record time, stuffing our gear into our backpacks without caring if things got left behind. I never once stopped scanning the woods. I knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. The entire hike back to the car felt wrong. The woods, once familiar, now seemed alien. Every tree like a twisted shadow, every sound making my heart lurch. Only when we reached the vehicle did I allow myself to breathe. We piled in, started the engine, and peeled out of there, the headlights barely piercing the darkness. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if something was following us. The haunting question. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. A spirit? A mimic? Some kind of predator that wears the faces of those it stalks? All I know is that something was out there, and it knew exactly how to pretend to be human. But the worst part? Before we left the site, as I was throwing the last of my gear into the car, I heard it, right behind me, a whisper, in my own voice. "See you soon." Story 3. The deadly encounters in the woods. Camping had always been a way for me and my friends to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. We were experienced, seasoned in survival, and had spent years exploring deep, isolated locations. But nothing in our collective experience prepared us for what we encountered on this trip. It was supposed to be a 5-day camping trip in the heart of the South Carolina wilderness. The four of us, James, Eric, Daniel, and I, had carefully chosen a remote location, miles from civilization. After a grueling drive down a dirt road, we reached a loop at the end, parked our cars, and hiked down toward our site, a perfect spot nestled against a riverbank. Surrounded by thick woods, for the first 2 days, everything was perfect, but on the third day, things took a turn we never saw coming. A lone afternoon in the wild. That morning, The guys decided they wanted to take a short trip across the state line into North Carolina to check out Sliding Rock, a natural water slide. I wasn't interested. I wanted to stay behind, relax, and do some solo fishing. After all, we were in a secluded spot. What could go wrong? I watched them disappear up the trail, their laughter fading into the trees. Then, I was alone. At first, it was peaceful. I made a quick meal, then wandered down to the river. The water was low, barely ankle deep in some areas. As I cast my fishing line, the midday sun warmed my back. Then, I felt it, that strange, crawling sensation up my spine. I wasn't alone. I slowly turned my head, scanning the tree line behind me. Nothing, just the thick brush swaying in the wind. I shook off the feeling and focused on my line. But the unease lingered, something watching from the woods. After catching and releasing a small catfish, I decided to explore a little further downriver. I waded through the shallow water, navigating the rocky terrain, until I found a perfect fishing spot near a set of rapids. The moment I settled onto a boulder, I heard it, a twig snapping. I whipped my head toward the source. Nothing. The thick canopy of trees stood undisturbed, motionless. Then, I heard it again, a slow, deliberate rustling of leaves. Someone, or something, was moving through the woods. My stomach tightened. I wasn't armed. My knife was back at camp. I had no defense except the small fishing rod in my hands. I decided to ignore it. Maybe it was just a deer. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then, the movement stopped, and in the silence, I felt it, eyes, watching me. I didn't stay to find out who or what it was. Gripping my gear, I bolted back upriver, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone lurking in the trees. But there was nothing, or at least, nothing I could see. The stranger in the river. By the time I reached camp, my nerves were shot. I checked my surroundings. No signs of intruders. The guys weren't back yet, so I sat by the fire pit, trying to shake the overwhelming feeling of unease. Then, I heard footsteps, sloshing. Someone was walking through the river, just beyond the tree line. My breath caught in my throat. I slowly turned my head. Standing in the shallow water was a man. He was tall, ragged, and filthy. His clothes were tattered, his skin leathery and sun-worn, and his face covered in a thick, tangled beard. But it was his eyes that froze me. They were dark, hollow, and too focused, locked onto our campsite with calculated intent. He didn't say a word, just stood there, the water swirling around his ankles, like he was deciding something. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe. My mind screamed at me to do something, but my body refused to move. Then, the silence broke. Afternoon. His voice was rough, hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Hey, you lost?" He took a slow step forward. The water splashed around his boots. "I own this land," he muttered. "These mountains, they're mine." I gripped my chair, my pulse pounding. Bullshit. We were in a state park, miles from private property, but something about the way he said it, so certain, so matter-of-fact, made my blood run cold. Then, he smiled, a toothless, unsettling grin. "You boys been respectful?" he asked. My mind flashed back to the broken branches, the beer cans, the stomping through the underbrush. I nodded. "Yeah, of course." He studied me, then nodded slowly. "I saw you earlier," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "Thought about coming over sooner." My stomach twisted. He had been watching me the whole time. I forced a tight smile. "Well, we were just about to pack up soon." Another pause. Then, he turned, but not before looking over his shoulder with a final warning. "You best be careful out here," he said. "Not everyone you run into is as friendly as me." Then, he was gone. I sat there, frozen, until I was sure he was out of sight. Then, I sprinted to my tent, grabbed my knife, and didn't let go. The escape. An hour later, my friends returned, laughing and joking, completely unaware of what had just happened. The moment they saw my face, their laughter died. "Dude, what's wrong?" James asked. I told them everything. By the time I finished, their faces were pale. "We're leaving," I said. Now. No one argued. We packed in record time, throwing our gear into the car without bothering to organize. The entire time, I watched the tree line, waiting to see if he was still there. I never saw him again. But I knew, deep down, he was watching. As we pulled out onto the dirt road, heading back toward civilization, no one spoke. Then, James broke the silence. "You think he was really alone out there?" The question made my stomach twist. We had no idea how long he had been watching us, or worse, if he had been alone at all. Story 4. The Man at the Cabin Door. Winter had always been my favorite season. There was something peaceful about the quiet stillness of snow-covered landscapes. The way the world seemed to slow down. Every year, I treated myself to a solo trip to a secluded cabin near a ski resort. The resort itself was expensive, but renting a cabin a few miles away was much more affordable. I had stayed in these cabins before and never had a problem. Until this trip. This time, I wasn't alone. This time, something was watching me. A knock in the dark. I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, just as the sun began dipping behind the mountains. The air was freezing, and the snow had settled in thick layers around the property. The place was simple: one bedroom, a fireplace, a small kitchen, but it was perfect for a peaceful getaway. After spending the day skiing, I returned to the cabin around 7 p.m. My legs ached, my fingers were frozen, and all I wanted was to warm up by the fire with a hot meal. I took a long shower, made some food, and settled into the couch, letting the fire's warmth soothe my exhaustion. Then, footsteps in the snow. They were faint at first, almost blending in with the crackling fire. But as they got closer, I knew someone was outside. I froze, my body instantly on high alert. Then came the knock. Not loud, not forceful, just two slow, deliberate taps. Something about it felt off. I got up cautiously, hesitating as I approached the door. Through the peephole, I saw him, a man, mid-30s, dark hair, thick beard. He was dressed in winter gear, but his face was strangely stiff, as if he had been standing outside for too long. His expression didn't match the situation. He wasn't shivering, he wasn't smiling, he wasn't nervous. He was just waiting. I hesitated before finally opening the door. Just a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man blinked, as if surprised. Then, after an awkward beat, he smiled. "Oh, hey, I think I booked this cabin for tonight." Something in his voice wasn't right. There was no frustration or concern, like you'd expect from someone who thought their reservation had been mixed up. Instead, his tone was flat, too calm. I frowned. "No, I booked this place for the week. You must have the wrong cabin." The man's smile didn't fade. "Oh, are you sure?" I tightened my grip on the door. "Yeah, I'm sure." A long pause. Then, he tilted his head slightly. "Could I maybe come inside for a minute? Just to warm up while I figure this out?" A cold wave of dread washed over me. No, absolutely not. There was no reason for him to be out here alone, miles from the main road, in the freezing cold, knocking on random cabins. I shook my head. "Sorry, man, I can't do that." His smile twitched, and for the first time, I saw something behind his eyes, something cold and calculating. Then, just as quickly as it came, it was gone. "All right," he said, stepping back. "Sorry to bother you." He turned and walked off into the night. I watched him go, my heart still hammering. The snow was deep, and the nearest occupied cabin was at least half a mile away. Where was he going? I waited, listening. No car engine, no crunching footsteps fading into the distance. Just silence. I locked the door, double-checking it before backing away. My instincts screamed that something wasn't right. But that was just the beginning. The shadow in the snow. 2 hours passed. I sat on the couch, the TV playing on low volume. But my mind wasn't focused on it. I kept glancing at the door, waiting for another knock, waiting for something. Finally, I decided to check. I turned off the lights, crept toward the door, and peered through the peephole. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. The cold night, the dim glow of the porch light reflecting off the snow. Then, a shadow, standing at the edge of the tree line. My breath caught in my throat. It was him. He was just standing there, half hidden by the trees. Watching. He had never left. A wave of nausea hit me as I backed away. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the number for the property management company. When they answered, I told them about the man, his claim that he had booked the cabin, his strange behavior. The woman on the other end sounded confused. "That's impossible. You're the only guest checked in for that cabin." I swallowed hard. Then why the hell was he here? A pause. Then, she said something that sent ice down my spine. "Do you want me to call the police?" Something about the way she asked it, like she had done this before, made my blood run cold. "Yes," I whispered. "Please." The things he left behind. The police arrived surprisingly fast, about 15 minutes later. 2 officers, both bundled up against the cold, knocked on the door. When I let them in, they didn't waste time with small talk. They searched the perimeter, following the man's tracks in the snow. And that's when they found it. A sling bag. He had hidden it behind a pile of logs near the cabin's edge. Inside, they found a hunting knife, a lockpicking set, a roll of duct tape. I felt like I was going to be sick. One of the officers exhaled sharply. "Yeah, he wasn't lost." I felt dizzy. "Did you find him?" The officer shook his head. "Tracks lead back to the woods," he said, "but he's gone." The question that still haunts me. The officers stayed for another half hour, taking my statement and reassuring me they'd patrol the area throughout the night. But I barely slept. Every sound, every creak of the wooden beams, every howl of the wind, sent a fresh wave of fear through me. Because no matter how much I tried to push it from my mind, I knew the truth. He had been watching me for hours. He had been waiting, and if I had let him inside. I don't let myself finish that thought. I checked out of the cabin the next morning, cutting my trip short. As I handed back the keys, the property manager gave me a tight smile. "You're not the first guest this has happened to," she admitted. I felt a chill creep up my spine. "And, did they ever catch him?" She hesitated. Then, shaking her head, she said, "No, we never do." The end. Thanks for watching. Do you love spine-chilling stories and eerie mysteries? You've come to the right place. At JT Scary Tales, we bring you the most terrifying and thrilling scary tales from around the world. From haunted places to unexplained phenomena, our scary tales will keep you on the edge of your seat. Subscribe now and dive into the dark world of scary tales.